Solid tales, history uncovered. We've all heard the myth of the World War II German stormtrooper, the so-called Aryan Superman who could fight for days without sleep, routing numerically superior forces time and again. Most people chalk this up to brilliant Blitzkrieg tactics and masterful military command, but lurking beneath the polished uniforms and Nazi propaganda was a far darker synthetic secret: Pervitin, or as we know it today, crystal meth. Today we know this drug as one of the most destructive, addictive substances on the planet, a chemical that shatters lives and destroys the human brain. But back in the 1930s, ignorance was a corporate shield. Methamphetamine first caught the eye of the Nazi regime, not on the battlefield, but in civilian life. After Japanese chemists first synthesized the compound and perfected mass production, German pharmaceutical firm Temmler Pharma saw its massive potential. In 1937, they patented their own potent methamphetamine formula, Pervitin. Marketed as an over-the-counter cure for depression and fatigue, it earned glowing reviews from the German medical establishment. Temmler pushed it into the veins of everyday civilian life. Factory workers swallowed it to survive grueling shifts. University students binged it to stay awake studying for days. Temmler aggressively marketed the drug using relentlessly catchy slogans. They made promises like, "If it doesn't pick you up, we'll make it right," and branded it as the housewife's go-to pick-me-up. Germans devoured it. Supply could barely keep up with demand, but a drug that could wipe out human exhaustion. It was destined to catch the eye of the ultimate customer, the Nazi war machine. So how did this over-the-counter pick-me-up turn into the fuel of the Nazi war machine? It all started with a military experiment that would change the face of modern warfare. By the spring of 1938, the German High Command began testing Pervitin's military potential. The task fell to Major Otto Ranke, director of the Institute for General and Defense Physiology. Ranke gathered 150 soldiers and divided them into controlled test groups, one dosed with Pervitin, one with caffeine, and one with morphine. Ranke forced the men to stay awake for 24 excruciating hours, then shoved mathematical equations in front of them. The results were stark. The soldiers running on caffeine and morphine had collapsed over their desks. But the Pervitin subjects were vibrating. They remained hyper-vigilant and highly agitated for dozens of hours. The drug didn't make them smarter. The soldiers couldn't solve math problems any better than before. But the military brass didn't care. They needed flesh and blood automatons. They needed soldiers who could charge into fire indefinitely without their eyelids drooping. When Germany unleashed its Blitzkrieg on Poland in September 1939, Pervitin proved its worth in blood and mileage. Frontline troops were handed foil-wrapped packets. The logistics corps became a convoy of insomniacs, with truck drivers staring dead-eyed into the dark, driving for 45 hours straight without resting. One German lieutenant, tasked with negotiating with the overwhelmed Poles, managed to stay awake and functioning for an astonishing 75 uninterrupted hours. But methamphetamine is a merciless master. Have you ever wondered what happens when an entire army builds a chemical tolerance? The recommended therapeutic dose was extremely low, but users quickly built up a crippling tolerance, taking exponentially more than was ever deemed safe, even turning to more dangerous methods of use to chase the fading high. The human heart can only take so much artificial acceleration. Death tolls across the Reich began to spike from cardiac arrest. On the front lines, the psychological horror of addiction manifested in blood. Friendly fire incidents surged as hallucinating German soldiers gunned down their own men. In one terrifying incident, a heavily overdosed soldier hallucinated that the towering trees around him were enemy infantry. He dumped his entire magazine into the woodline. Out of ammunition, his chemical rage demanded more violence. He threw himself at an ancient oak, tearing at the bark with his bare hands and then with his own teeth. By dawn, the tree was stripped bare, and the soldier's mouth was a ruined, bloody cavern. By November 1939, The horrific physical toll forced the Reich Health Office to heavily regulate Pervitin. But the greatest military offensive in modern history was looming. In the autumn of 1939, legendary commanders Erich von Manstein and Heinz Guderian realized that defeating the massive French and British armies conventionally was impossible. Their only hope was a hyper-aggressive armored thrust through the dense Ardennes forest. But a delay for sleep would give the French time to react and slaughter the stalled columns. The solution was dark but simple. In April 1940, the Reich Defense Ministry reclassified Pervitin as an official military supply. Over the months that followed, more than 35 million Pervitin tablets would be issued to German troops, with tens of millions rushed to the staging grounds ahead of the invasion. When the assault began in May, the Allied defenders were facing a nightmare. They were fighting men who did not sleep. France capitulated in just 39 days, a shocking military upset that was driven not by racial superiority, but by a pharmaceutical lab's methamphetamine formula. In the wake of the French conquest, the Nazi high command was deeply divided over the drug's horrific side effects. In June 1941, the Reich Health Office finally slammed the gavel, officially classifying Pervitin as a dangerous narcotic. But just 10 days later, Operation Barbarossa launched. The invasion of the Soviet Union began, and the military instantly demanded the drug's return. Mountains of Pervitin were shipped to the freezing, blood-soaked plains of the Eastern Front. This chemical rot went all the way to the top. Adolf Hitler himself was notoriously dependent on a daily cocktail of narcotics. His personal physician regularly injected him with Pervitin, opioid painkillers, and a host of other untested drugs. Historians still debate how many of his erratic, suicidal military orders in the war's final days were driven by late-stage amphetamine psychosis. When Soviet artillery reduced Berlin to rubble in 1945, you'd think the era of military meth was over. But you'd be wrong. When Germany split 4 years later, the legacy of Pervitin didn't fade. Both the West German Bundeswehr and the East German National People's Army continued to issue amphetamine-based stimulants to troops for decades, right through the height of the Cold War. It wasn't until the late 1980s, on the eve of German reunification, that the last of these military stimulant programs were finally shut down, closing the book on a 50-year legacy of state-sponsored drug use. The so-called invincible soldier was, in reality, nothing more than a victim of a chemical lie. If you want to uncover more untold stories from the Second World War, hit the like button and subscribe to Solid Tales. Drop a comment below. Did you know the truth behind the Nazis' so-called super soldiers? Let us know what you want to hear about next. History Uncovered. Subscribe to Solid Tales.